This is Alan Smith. Good evening. New figures have revealed that hospitals in England are performing at their worst level since records began, failing to meet key targets. Labour and the Liberal Democrats have laid the blame on the government, describing the figures as disgusting and shameful. But the Prime Minister says the problem is due to increased demand. Both Labour and the Conservatives have struggled to give clear messages on what their intentions are on immigration. British and Romanian police, jointly investigating an international people trafficking ring, have made 19 arrests in London. 29 women have been freed. Heavy rain across England has caused widespread disruption, with more than 100 schools closed in the West Midlands and people having to be rescued from stranded vehicles. The Italian government is about to declare a state of emergency over the flooding in Venice, with the Prime Minister describing it as a blow to the heart of our country. Official figures show that NHS hospitals in England are performing at their worst level since modern records began. On all three of its key measures, the health service failed to meet its targets. About 1 in 6 people waited longer than 4 hours for treatment in accident and emergency departments in October. About the same proportion of patients are facing delays of 18 weeks or more for routine procedures, pushing the number on the waiting list to an all-time high. And the target for cancer treatment hasn't been met in nearly 4 years. Senior NHS officials have warned the figures paint a bleak picture as the busy winter period approaches. Our first report tonight is from our health editor, Hugh Pym.
This is essentially a story of unrelenting pressure, with patient demand rising faster while resources fail to keep up. 5 years ago, in October 2014, there were just under 470,000 emergency hospital admissions. Last month, there were more than 560,000. And in October, the number of patients who had to wait more than 4 hours in A&E was more than 3 times the level 5 years ago. Sometimes a shortage of beds is the problem. There are more than 4.4 million on the waiting list for routine operations and procedures. John McGall from York had an operation on his heart 3 weeks ago after 3.5 years of hospital visits and waiting for tests.
4 months to get the appointment, 4 months to get the results, and then that's one appointment for one test. And I've had quite a lot of tests over the years. I'd say that the NHS have saved my life, and I'm not calling the NHS, but they've also ruined it as well.
Workforce shortages are making it harder for hospitals to deliver the care they want. Dr. Rebecca Fisher of the Health Foundation think tank says there's been a failure of long-term planning.
At the moment, we have pretty dire shortages right across the NHS. So, for example, there are 40,000 nursing vacancies at the moment. There are also critical shortages in areas like general practice. And over the last decade, we simply haven't resolved those problems. They're now mounting up, and I think that's reflected in some of the data that we're seeing today.
Scotland's A&E performance in September was ahead of England's in October. Wales and Northern Ireland lagged behind. The pressures across the UK are familiar. Stresses in social and community care, resulting in more elderly patients with long-term conditions going to hospital rather than being looked after closer to home. Addressing them will take time and money.
Labour has branded the figures disgusting, while the Conservatives have blamed rising demand. Both parties have pledged to increase NHS spending if they win next month's election. The Liberal Democrats have also promised more investment, but say they'll put a penny on income tax to raise the funds. Here's our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
The timing of today's figures could scarcely be more helpful to Labour, coming just 24 hours after their keynote policy pledge to rescue the NHS with a £26 billion real-term spending boost. Not surprisingly, senior Labour figures were quick to seize on the waiting times to bolster their claim that the health service was in crisis because of what they dubbed a decade of decay under the Tories. The Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth, warned of abject misery for patients this winter if there was no change, with A&E departments at risk of being overwhelmed, while this was the response of the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn.
It is disgraceful, and it is a problem of the lack of staff and the lack of funding for it. So a Labour government will increase NHS funding by 23-24 by £26 billion a year, which will deal with all of that.
Senior Tories, including the Prime Minister, responded by blaming the rise in waiting times on patient demand and cautioned that Labour's approach to immigration would further increase pressure on the NHS. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, also suggested the figures did not reflect the significant improvements elsewhere in the health service.
Well, we've clearly seen a very significant increase in demand for hospital services over the last 12 months. Now, parts of the system are responding extremely well. In terms of getting operations done, there's been a 7% rise. So when people talk about the performance of the NHS, in many ways, the NHS is performing better than it ever has.
Mr. Hancock's response, however, prompted fury among the health unions, who accused him of colossal complacency, while the Liberal Democrats warned that pressure on the NHS would only increase with Brexit. The senior Lib Dem, Chukwuemeka.
You cannot escape from the impact of Brexit. So by keeping us in the European Union, we want to stop Brexit and ensure the UK remains in the European Union. That will help with recruitment, because at the moment EU citizens on whom we rely are being put off coming and serving in our NHS.
Well, any day in which the NHS dominates the election campaign will always be regarded as a good day for Labour. The challenge the party face, however, is in ensuring this is not an isolated day and that Brexit is not allowed to overshadow concerns about the health service.
The performance of NHS hospitals in England has been deteriorating for a number of years. Our reality check correspondent Chris Morris considers the impact of rising demand and what it could take to reverse the trend.
The population of the UK is getting bigger and people are living longer, so it's hardly surprising that health services are under enormous strain. But that's not the whole picture. We've been living through nearly a decade of austerity in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008. Since the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government came to power in 2010, spending on the NHS in England rose by an average of just 1.3% a year until 2018, after taking account of inflation. It was the most dramatic spending squeeze in NHS history, well below the average annual figure of 3.6% above inflation, stretching all the way back to 1949. So if the crisis is not to deepen, something has to change. And one thing we do know is that whoever wins this election, spending on the NHS will rise substantially. But even throwing money at the problem will not produce immediate results, because the crisis is not just in funding, it's also in recruitment. There are tens of thousands of vacancies which will take time to fill, and this is where the state of the health service starts to collide with other controversial policy areas, such as Brexit and immigration. In the longer term, the future of the NHS also depends on the wider health system. Without more investment in social care and public health, the NHS risks being overwhelmed. There are no quick fixes and no easy answers to one of the most important issues in this general election campaign.
The Conservatives have said it would be great if net migration